And the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Hello and welcome to the only independent news and opinion program where we chronicle two distinct possibilities, either the demise and possible extinction of the Homo sapien or the greatest leap forward in human history. One thing is certain, there is no status quo. This is the Daily Australian Radio Show, episode number 67 for Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. My name, Jason Olborn, one half of this news partnership, making the rounds and getting people very excited that they can believe in the media again. And here is my other half, Nicola Charles. Welcome back to the News Hour.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. I'm very happy. We found out in the last few days that my South African Mastiff, my beautiful girl, is pregnant. So that's very exciting for us. I get to have babies without any of the hard work, Jason. And she's pregnant from our golden retriever. So I'm going to call them golden baubles.
That is so exciting. A South African Mastiff and a golden retriever.
Yeah, so it will be the most stacked golden retriever you've ever seen. But I just want to share really quickly, look, some really interesting health news has emerged. And it all stems from this Port Hedland motion. But something very interesting has occurred on the Limestone Coast in South Australia. So people are going into these councils and they're going at it, right? They really want to know what's going on. What's the responsibility of, who's who in the zoo and whose job is it to do X, Y, and Z? And some interesting stuff has occurred. Now, I can share underneath the show today on my social media, and I'll send it to Jason, this link to something, a document called the Limestone Coast Regional Public Health and Wellbeing Plan 2021 to 2026. So it's very relevant. So it highlights the potentially legal obligation of the South Australian Council, and obviously use your own discretion to discover in your local council area, on public health, that when some councillors tend to stand up and have their noses in the air and state, I'm not going to support this motion because public health is not the role of the council, it's a state and federal issue. We hear that a lot. It's not us, it's a state and federal issue. Well, this document that I'm going to share under the show today states on page 3 that in South Australia, the South Australia Act considers the role of local council to be the public health authority in the region. Now, obviously, this is really interesting, following on from the Port Hedland motion, and you can all find that at porthedlandmotion.info/council. And it's something you really need to look into, because it might be that we've all been had, that these federal and state authorities, like the National Cabinet that Scott Morrison was talking about, and horrible individuals like Dan Andrews, may not have actually had the authority to mandate everything, which, if that turns out to be true, Jason, is devastating for a lot of people.
Goodness me, if it's not bad enough, but then for it to be unlawful and to be found out, and then what remedy are people entitled to at that point? It certainly makes an interesting case now for the fact that there needs to be a form of collective defence against such boundless authority, if you will, this idea that anything goes.
Rampant authority, totally.
When you call something an emergency,
yeah,
you then get away literally with whatever you want to do. And so it seems now that if there was an institution that was able to defend properly and be heard against said mandates, rather than an individual turning up in a court system. Look, I remember going to the courtroom to defend a fine that I received during COVID. I was literally working the only person on an entire floor in a building, so outside of the public's way, just doing some work, and it was on the first floor. And for whatever reason, a series of pens that I were using, they all didn't work at the same time. So I wandered downstairs in this building where there was one person sitting on the front desk at reception, and I was looking for a pen. And as luck would have it, with the glass windows of this shop front, a police officer literally walked past and looked in and saw the receptionist and myself wandering around looking for a pen, knocked on
Oh
the door,
dear.
came inside and gave me a $500 fine for not wearing a mask inside a premises.
You're lucky. Some people got $20,000 fines for that.
Well, I was an individual, and that was the scenario anyway. So it took 2 years to get to a court, and the magistrate, threw it out pretty much on the spot, but not before he said something along the lines of, "We get plenty of fools in here. We don't need another fool like you, Mr. Osborne." And then he said, "Case dismissed." And I could only sort of laugh under my breath. But interestingly, the police officer that gave me the fine had to attend court that day, and it was on a particular day that this Newcastle court had decided to re-implement a mask mandate. Like, would you believe it? A year and a bit after any of this had been on. So this poor sergeant sitting there in the courtroom with a mask on. Now, I pulled out my mask exemption and said I will not be wearing a mask. Certainly here to defend this particular thing. You guys are out of your minds. No one dared challenge me inside the court. The magistrate wasn't wearing a mask. I wasn't wearing a mask, but this sergeant was. Now, at the end of it, when it was dismissed, I looked at the sergeant, went over to him, and we looked at each other. He pulled his mask down and he said, "Congratulations," and shook my hand. And I and I thought, you know what? At least there was mutual respect. It was kind of like two boxers belting each other to smithereens in the ring, and at the end of the fight, embracing themselves because the
No,
fight
but
was over.
do you know what that was? See, here's the thing, right? Because it's the same with this climate hoax and the Agenda 2030 and 30 by 30 and Agenda 2050 and all that. And they said, oh, they've penetrated the local councils. Well, not enough. They haven't, right? So what they have penetrated is federally and statewide. Obviously, the premiers, they look so nervous if you think about Michael Gunner and Dan Andrews and their eyes going off in different directions, and they were definitely being told, warned, threatened, bribed, whatever. But they don't have the resources, and I don't think it would work anyway, to go in and bribe all local councillors. And the thing about local council, and the good thing about local council, which goes back to Greek democracy, is that it's a high turnover, right? It's always changing. New blood is always coming in. And this could be the thing that trips up the New World Order, right? Because they won't be able to keep on top of the ordinary people that run for council. And the people that run for council are people that are liked or admired or trusted in a particular region, in an area, right? Liked because you're a farmer that gives people lots of employment, or liked because you do things for the community. These are not people in local council that usually think about massive agendas. And we've even seen that in the UK, in London, when local councillors come and they want to get voted in, and they do a talk in the pub, and the people in the pub are going, yeah, but we're not going to vote you into local council if you're up for 15-minute cities and Agenda 2030. And so I think it's harder for them to compromise, let's say, local councillors. I would hope so. And this could be the way we bring an end to all this. Because if you think back to when you were a little kid, and you would always get that day, and kids still get that day in school where they say, local councils are coming in with their vaccines, and you get a form as a parent, and any kid, if you want your kid to get this vaccine or that vaccine or not, fill in the form and let us know. And it's always when I think back now, it's always a local council form, and the schools always say the council's coming in. Because I said to my son's school, which was a private Catholic school in Melbourne, I said, why are you offering the kids all these vaccines? They're an experiment, this, that, and the other. They said, it's not us, it's the local council. And so it was always and is always the local council. But because the top of our political structure got compromised, councils kind of fell into line, I think, and did as they were told. They essentially complied. And now we're finding out they didn't need to, and they don't need to. And because they're diverse, and because they are essentially us, they all know people that have died, Jason. So I think they're probably not going to let that happen again.
Something interesting about this council approach in terms of the globalist plan through Agenda 2030, etc., and the managed retreat, etc., white papers, and it was Kate Mason that brought up, and so what happens is that if they were to go to a global government scenario, this is the plan. What would happen is that each country's governments, their federal governments, would only become administrators of the AI World Government Plan. So they'd still have this particular government, but wouldn't have the ability to make certain decisions or any decisions, depending on how that was to arrange. Now, the other thing was that the councillors or the councils would also be somewhat replaced, because part of this plan was to introduce this overarching global regional, if you will, form of government that
we
would be
can't
making
let
the
that
decisions.
happen because that's
Correct.
us. The councils are us.
Correct. So this is the point. So once people can understand the infrastructure, so what it does, it's a bit like the WHO in that it's a quasi-government sort of organization, but then all these governments just fall into line and say, well, we will do what the WHO says, and YouTube says you can't publish anything that the WHO doesn't approve, and therefore they take it off if you dare challenge them, and so it becomes a de facto authority, even though it's got no authority. So this
It's
is
got
the
lots
same.
of money. That's the only reason they can, force online, buy off Google and everyone else, and force you to believe it. That's all it is. It's a big marketing scam.
Yes, but isn't it interesting the way that they introduce it from a soft perspective, and then all of a sudden it just assumes power? It's the old Godfather line: real power can't be given, it must be taken. And when you have willing participants, those going along to get along, and those that perhaps have been framed with some form of compromise, at least at the highest levels, it's very easy to see how they just fall in line. But what happens in government, the problem is that these people that get themselves elected, there's a hierarchy within the system. So you're some young whippersnapper, to use that term, and you get elected somehow, and you walk into whichever it's local government or state government or federal government, and you fall under the wing of some senior person who tells you the way that it is. And very quickly you can either go along to get along, or you can challenge. But you can rest assured that if you challenge, they'll work out a way to, come back at you one way or another. So you certainly know who your friends and who your enemies are. So in many ways, whilst I don't envy Senator Ralph Babette's position of being the only UAP person who got into office, at the same time, it provides him with an enormous amount of freedom, because there's no one there to stand over him, except, of course, for the opponents. But he already knows that he's their enemy. It's just an interesting perspective.
Yeah. And, you talked about when you were, part of the Labour Party, and they said to you, by the way, you'll be voting no on this. And you were like, what? Someone else decided that. And you talk about quasi-authority, right? This Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Parliament, who, by the way, very much like Jacinta Allen, the very unpopular Jacinta Allen premier voted by no one of Victoria, she was unelected, Ursula von der Leyen, and she is essentially speaking for Europe, over and above the elected members of the European Parliament, so much so that she gets to spend billions of dollars on vaccines, do deals, and then not share her text messages about those deals. And she's just approached Trump on behalf of Europe, and she's offered a 0-for-0 tariff deal between Europe and America. Now, she's unelected, Jason. This is what I'm saying. They've essentially assumed authority over a whole bunch of elected people.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And yet people just go along to get along. Now, something really interesting that many people wouldn't have caught up on, but there's a video clip running around on social media of Queensland Premier David Crisafulli in Parliament last week. And there he is, pretty much banging his hands on the table, saying the United Nations will not tell us what to do.
Great clip.
Isn't it fabulous? Yeah. And so Crisafulli, who has been doing the rounds for some time, and I actually met someone at the weekend who knows him personally, and said that he called 15 years ago that he'll one day become the Premier of Queensland. He said this is a good guy. So very interesting. And he's also become the most popular Premier, I believe, at the moment, which is quite often the case with a newly elected Premier with new ideas, and he just happens to be young and fit and good looking and got a personality.
Yeah, but he also says the UN are not going to tell me what to do. The UN are not here. We are. That's why he's going to get elected. You say stuff like that, you're getting elected.
Yep, exactly right. So it's a big deal. Now, in another interesting, speaking of videos going around on social media, Nancy Pelosi has come out today, and she said something along the lines of Donald Trump and the Republicans are driving us toward recession with reckless tariffs that are nothing more than a massive tax hike on Americans. His inept trade war is crashing the economy, raising costs, and wiping out the hard-earned savings of working families across the country. So that's what you'd expect her to say. Well, as the internet does, there is an incredible clip from 1996 where Nancy Pelosi is speaking before the Congress on tariffs and the trade deficit with China, and she says, on this day, your member of Congress could have drawn a line to say that the President of the United States do something about this US-China trade relationship that is a job loser for the United States. 30 years later, and our annual trade deficit is now approximately 300 billion. So there is Pelosi, almost verbatim, saying exactly what Trump is saying today. And this reinstates or reinforces the fact, I should say, that Democrats always like to hold two sides on every issue to always be right, though they never are. And it's to appear the way to their low information support base who are wholly dependent on government because they believe that without that crutch, they are convinced they could not survive in society. So those people that just blindly go along, and there's another great clip of this kid at one of these Doge protests, Elon Musk protests, and someone asked him, what are you here for? And he literally pulled out a piece of paper. He said, well, we were given this piece of paper to explain what's going on. I don't really understand it, but he's there anyway because he's been told that Elon Musk is a fascist. It's extraordinary. And this is what I mean by low information people. They're literally willing to get out there, and this is the bandwagon. So as it turns out, I believe Tesla is introducing that brand new motor vehicle. Is that true? The bandwagon?
Yeah, I did post that. They do jump on the bandwagon. Listen, when I lived in America for 7 years, the one thing I did learn is that Nancy Pelosi is one of the most evil, corrupt, and just sickening people I've ever seen operate in politics. She was I think, the Speaker of the House at the time. And she was an insider trader. That's what she did. So she would invest in, for instance, US chip companies, and then she would make sure in the House that Chinese chips were not allowed in, and you could only use American chips. And of course, she'd already invested in those. And so when she says that what Trump's doing with this adjustment is taking money out of the pockets of ordinary people, actually what he's doing is taking the money out of these insider traders. And perhaps they didn't see it coming. I mean, they must have had an inkling, but perhaps they left their money there because weren't trillions and trillions of dollars lost? I know even in Australia during this adjustment, and it's cost them money. And that's why she's out there saying something. All she cares about, Nancy Pelosi, is money. I've never seen her do or say a single thing that benefited Americans.
No, that is Nancy Pelosi to a T, and the idea that you can play both sides of the fence and people just continue to go along is just absolute, next level lack of information. But it is interesting to watch that people will believe or become rusted on, and they just don't want to look outside the square. And so the reward is for anyone that's willing to look and see what's different. But if you can't see it, you become trapped in it, and the rhetoric just flows and flows, and you'll only ever find the negatives. And you wonder why people continue to fail. But it's this weird thing. It's this glass is half empty, or the better the devil you know. And so you are stuck in this trap that you can never get out of simply because of the way that you think. And you literally, you are what you think about. Napoleon Hill, for goodness sake, Think and Grow Rich. It is right there. If you only think a certain way, you will only get a certain thing, a certain outcome.
I just think that all of these people that financially benefited from our pain, and they actually described it at Event 201 as profiting from pain. A banker said at the table, "We have learned to profit from pain." And it was one of the most hideous sentences I think I've ever heard uttered. And she said it with a smile on her face, and she didn't care. So you've arranged a world where you guys get to profit from pain. I mean, it was really extraordinary. So all of those who did, the Dan Andrews, the Scott Morrisons, the Anthony Albanese's, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Joe Bidens, the Boris Johnsons, the Rishi Sunaks, you would imagine, Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, you would imagine that they would go quietly into the night with their money and not stay around irritating people, bragging about a loss of money on the stock market. Go away. You're lucky you're not in Gitmo. Don't you swan around here, and Dan Andrews seems to know better because I'm friends with a private detective. And he sent me a photo the other week. I don't know where he was. Private detectives hang out near courts and businesses and stuff. But he was sitting in a car park and he saw Dan Andrews getting out of a Mazda SUV and he photographed him and he sent me the photograph. And I was like, whoa, it's really smart because he has to drive around in an ordinary car. Because if he drove around in a big Mercedes or a Bentley and people recognized him, he'd probably be chased down the road, right? Because he was so destructive in Victoria. And so perhaps he's one of the smart ones. It seems his family might have nicked off to America as well. But these ones like Pelosi that come back, I mean, it's sickening. I don't know how they've got the nerve. You've got some nerve to stand up and talk about, the share market, Pelosi. My God.
I find it interesting because these people know that the moment that they surrender their power, it's over for them. They become a normal person, and they don't have those privileges. And not only that, but we've seen the Trump administration remove the security clearances of so many people connected: Biden, Harris, Hillary Clinton, various others as well. I don't know why they would even keep those said security clearances, but
Is that the deep state?
Well, again, Biden took it away from Trump, and he was the first to take it off a former president, which was a privilege that was given to all presidents. Like Jimmy Carter kept one up until to his death, etc. But Biden saw no reason for Trump to have it, which shows you that they are enemies. And this is the point. So now they've taken it away on the other side. And so in an information war, this provides an advantage. So what you see now is when people like Jim Brennan, the former director of the CIA, very, very dubious character, to be polite, you see now him scrapping on certain shows like, CNN, etc. And he hasn't got the inside info that he once had. So what he's saying is no more than anyone else would have at this particular juncture, given that all those 51 intelligence agencies were all punished for their role in pushing that the Hunter Biden laptop was a hoax, and they all lost their security clearances. So this is a big deal in the information war. So much changing. Now, Nicola, we have a huge news bulletin today. There's a lot to get through, and given that we're a third of the way through the show, I want to get through the news. It's going to take me a good sort of 8 or 9 minutes to get through it, everyone. But at the other side, we're going to continue with a massive conversation on so many different issues. And once again, the narrative is weaving, and we'll get stuck into it right now. How about that?
Fantastic. Let's go.
All right. So the US will start direct high-level talks with Iran over its nuclear program this weekend, Donald Trump has said, making the surprise announcement during a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started, Trump told reporters in the Oval after a meeting that was meant to focus on Israel's bid to avoid US tariffs. Maybe a deal's going to be made. That would be great. We are meeting very importantly on Saturday at almost the highest level. Peter Dutton has predicted Australia could be facing a global recession as fears emerge. The stock market plunge could force baby boomers to delay their retirement. The warning comes as both he and Anthony Albanese will be out to prove who is better to run the national economy during times of great uncertainty fueled by Donald Trump's global tariffs. Both sides of politics are recalibrating their campaign in light of these events, with Treasurer Jim Chalmers predicting a double rate cut in May, as millions of Australians have their retirement income savings smashed. The price of oil has dropped more than US $15 a barrel, now below US $60 a barrel for the first time in 4 years. Banks are discussing 4 interest rate rises, with Jim Chalmers even suggesting a 0.5% cut next month. Across the world, stock markets plummeted as they opened for the week, with trading halts in Japan's futures market and also in Taiwan. China's stock market fell 10% at opening. Trump said we have massive financial deficits with China, the EU, and many others. The only way this problem can be cured is with tariffs, which are now bringing tens of billions of dollars into the USA. They're already in effect, and a beautiful thing to behold. The surplus with these countries has grown during the presidency of Sleepy Joe Biden, and we're going to reverse it quickly. Now, the market overreaction has been unbelievable, said Michael Lee of Michael Lee Strategy. He was the founder on Fox News, and typically in every single one of these situations outside of 2008, when you have these sorts of pullbacks, you are significantly higher 3 months, 6 months later, and of course 12 months later. Meanwhile, as you just said, Nicola, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced the EU is prepared to negotiate with the US, offering zero for zero tariffs for industrial goods. She emphasised Europe is always ready for a good deal, keeping the proposal open. Meanwhile, the White House has just confirmed that there will be no 90-day pause on the tariffs for any countries. Meanwhile, Secretary Bessent has said that the top 10% of Americans own 88% of equities, 88% of the stock market. The next 40% owns 12% of the stock market, and the bottom 50 has debt, credit card bills, renting homes, auto loans, and we've got to give them some relief. Remember when as late as yesterday, someone, or all of us, were calling for cost of living relief? Well, lower oil prices means lower transport costs. It also means lower grocery prices at the supermarket, lower interest rates, lower mortgages, and therefore rents. Lower US Australian dollar value means more export sales. Now, Australia, thanks to Harvey Norman boss Gerry Harvey, charges 10% on everything coming into the country, even on $5 items you buy on eBay. So that same 10% is all the US will collect off us. How come nobody points the finger at Gerry Harvey? Chinese Communist Party's efforts to infiltrate and exert soft power on Australia's academic system is losing steam after 6 major universities have quietly shut down their Confucius institutes. This comes as Western democracies, including Australia, become increasingly alert to the CCP tactics to influence young, impressionable minds with socialist ideology. The closures that began during COVID and accelerated in the last year include the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, which was the first Australian university to close its Confucius Institute after cancelling an affiliated Chinese medicine program with the CCC-sponsored organisation in 2021. It was followed by the University of New South Wales in 2022 and the University of WA in 2023. The University of Adelaide was reported to have ended its cooperation with the Confucius Institute, though it hasn't officially confirmed or denied the move. With the closure of these 6 institutes by major Australian universities, 7 still remain at the universities of Sydney, Newcastle, Queensland, University of Technology, Griffith, La Trobe, Victoria, and Charles Darwin University. I think that's, is it Charles Darwin or Charles Sturt? Anyway, Feng Chongyi, an associate professor in China Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney, said the original intention behind establishing Confucius Institutes was to deepen ties between Australia and the CCP. The reason why the established Confucius Institutes was to show goodwill towards the Chinese government, to get funding from the Chinese government, to recruit Chinese students and to set up cooperative projects in China. Meanwhile, Peter Dutton has vowed to slash the number of international students in Australia by 80,000 in a move to ease the housing crisis. He will also triple the cost of student visa application charge to $5,000 for a group of 8 universities, including Sydney and Melbourne universities. It will increase from $1,600 to $2,500 for remaining international students. A new charge of $2,500 will be introduced for students who wish to change education providers. Dutton will tell voters today that while Albanese plans to bring in 1.8 million new immigrants over 5 years, Labor's housing policies are yet to deliver a single new home. He warned the number of international students studying in Australia has soared by 65% from nearly 520,000 international students in the year to the last election to more than 850,000 today. The fallout from Dutton's plan to disendorse Whitlam candidate Ben Britton for the Liberals highlights the weakness of character of Dutton, according to Joel Jamal, who slammed Dutton in a 4-minute clip you can see on my page. Jamal played the clip of his original interview with Ben Britton, who explained women in the military were forced into combat roles. There was an enormous discharge rate due to injury as high as 80%, and that women's hips were being destroyed by the loads they had to carry. He also pointed to the fact that servicewomen have an 87% higher rate of suicide than the rest of society. Instead of dealing with the elephant in the room, Dutton cut off his candidate, whom Jamal argues would have won the seat from Labor. The point is they aren't defending the truth. They are defending the illusion. Idaho is set to become the latest state in the US to allow anti-parasitic drug ivermectin to be sold without a prescription after the state legislature passed a measure. Senate Bill 1211 was easily approved in the state legislature on April 4 and delivered the same day to Governor Brad Little's desk. The bill, according to its text, adds to existing law to provide that ivermectin may be sold or purchased without a script or consultation with a healthcare professional, meaning it can be sold over the counter. Interesting, they told us that you would die from this horse paste. The bill passed 29-9 in the Senate and 66-1 in the House. Little has not publicly commented on whether he will sign the bill or not. The Epoch Times, who wrote the story, contacted the governor's office for comment on Sunday. And Senator Tammy Nichols, a Republican, presented the bill on the floor on April 3rd. We're not mandating the use, we're not prescribing treatment, and we're not mandating that it be sold. What we're doing with the bill is simple. We are removing a barrier. Earlier this year, it was Arkansas that allowed over-the-counter sale of ivermectin after state legislature passed a measure which was signed by Republican Governor Sarah Huckabee. And in 2022, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, also a Republican, signed a similar measure. Dan Bongino, the Deputy Director of the FBI, has released a stunning statement that will reassure those who wishing to see justice there is certainly actions happening. Time permitting, I will read his full statement later in the show. In the US, Meta, the parent of Facebook, will end fact-checking tomorrow and commence community notes instead, like you see on X. I stress this is for the US and not for Australia. And the Cleveland Clinic study titled Effectiveness of the Influenza Vaccine During the 24-25 Respiratory Viral Season has just been uploaded to the preprint server on medRxiv. And this study analysed over 53,000 Cleveland Clinic employees and found that those who received the flu vaccine in the 24-25 season were statistically more likely to contract the flu compared to those who remained unvaccinated, a negative efficacy estimate of 26.9% negative. There you go. And 8 individuals in the US are facing charges following a proactive investigation by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Authorities uncovered advertisements on social media platforms, including TikTok, offering large amounts of child sex abuse material for sale. The investigation revealed a group led by Mehmet Berk Bozyuk from Turkey, a resident there, that transferred massive amounts of material to buyers, including 8 men in the United States. Nicola.
Oh, God. Get the flu shot, more likely to get flu. Get the COVID shot, more likely to get COVID. It's ridiculous. I would like to commend Idaho, back to my regular voice, for selling ivermectin. I would advise everyone have it in your cupboard the way you have other things like aspirin in your cupboard. It is anti-parasitic, to sound like a broken record. It is in the shampoo you use for nits on your children's hair. It's ivermectin that kills the nits. And if you take it into your body, it kills parasites in your body, and parasites in your body are now believed to be cancer. So ivermectin could be the cure for cancer, but that's just my humble opinion. Disclaimer on the Daily Australian. Now, let me get into 2 closely linked stories in Australia. Repulsive, disgusting, sleazy, Albanese. So Albanese wants to let in 1.8 million migrants into Australia, immigrants, migrants, whatever you want to call them, facilitating an invasion into this country without any public consultation, you little creep. Now, the other story, the CCP and bringing these Confucius institutes into Australia, and now they're closing down, and some are and some aren't. And of course, we're keeping ours in Victoria because, Victoria likes its relationship with China. But the question is, why? Why would we want deeper ties? You referenced their deeper ties. Why would we want deeper ties with a country that still keeps and owns slaves just because they disagree with them religiously? So there's no religious freedom there. There's no freedom there. There's no freedom of speech. They don't value the lives and freedoms of other people. Now, if Australia started using its quarantine centres as slave camps, imagine we import all these new migrants to Australia, and it baffles the mind, as far as I'm concerned, that all these new Australians think they're coming here to be free and safe. I mean, they clearly are not across what the Australian government is capable of at this time in history. But imagine we suddenly decided, we've changed our minds, and we decide that all of our new migrants, having different beliefs to us, suddenly become slaves, and we're going to let them make phones and sports clothing the way the slaves in China do. Do you think America would still do business with Australia, or would everyone around the world be absolutely fine with Australian products? Not that there are any, other than the odd boomerang. We're not allowed to make anything in this country anymore. It's absolutely outrageous. And you're saying that the Confucius Institutes were to strengthen deeper ties between the Chinese Communist Party and Australia. Why is Australia and America and the UK and the European Union and the UN, who I now don't believe even exist after this pandemic, this engineered pandemic, why are we not outraged at the keeping of slaves in China? This is over 1 million men, boys and men between the ages of 9 and 60, who've been yanked from their families to never have families of their own, to be put in chains, to be beaten, to be starved and forced to work. And that's their life and that's it. Now, we've got more empathy in our countries for the welfare of animals than we've got for these people in China. And then people say, well, you know, you can't say anything about China because that's racist. Well, is racist worse than slave owning? I don't know, right? Is slave owning fine? I just want one of our politicians to come out and say to me that keeping slaves is not racist. If they can say to me that keeping slaves is not racist, then the whole world changes, right, Jason? Is that what they're saying?
This is the ultimate thing, isn't it? Because out of mind, out of sight. And this is the idea of playing two sides on every issue, because you're absolutely right. And yet, why is there silence?
It boggles the mind to me. And often the cultures that come to Australia, and, you know, as I say, I am, you know, I'm a migrant myself, right? And in my business now where I'm working, I'm dealing with a lot of the new Australians. And I've got to say, for the large part, they're lovely. Well, they're lovely to me. You know, they probably want better pricing from me. They're quite canny with money. They like a nice deal, and I don't blame them. So does everyone else. But at the same time, you must understand that a lot of cultures that are coming here to a place where we're told, the OGs, the original Australians, you can't be racist, you can't be anything, right? You can't be anti-Semitic, you can't be Islamophobic, you can't be racist, you can't be homophobic, you can't be transphobic, you can't be anything. You can't have a political opinion. I've learned that the hard way. My bottom is bruised from the beatings the government has given me about my political opinion. But a lot of these cultures that are coming into Australia are themselves racist. So it's quite the juxtaposition that the government is telling us not to be racist to the new Australians who are in fact racist. So very odd, Jason. It's a very odd kettle of fish we're currently living in.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, to think that we now have completely a two-speed system. We have a two-speed economy. We have a two-speed legal system, if you will. We have these new laws in Victoria that came out at some ridiculous time in the morning that has a Sam Kerr provision in it. Sam Kerr can't get in trouble for what she faced court for, but you can because of the presumed colour of your skin, for goodness sake. And so it can only go one way. At the end of the day, there is going to be division, whether it be now or whether it be in a year or 2 years or 3 years. But at some point, the Australian public, presumably that before they're completely taken over, and it is the old frog in the boiling pot scenario, before they stand up and say no. But what's interesting, whilst Dutton is losing traction in the polls, we're told, but we're still almost 4 weeks away from the election, which is an eternity. Anything could possibly happen. I mean, Albanese could fall over again, and that might be enough for people to notice that he's not up for the task. But Dutton now is using immigration to be the one thing that is dividing the uni party to at least try and win office. But anyone who's watching at the moment are just wondering what the hell's going on. And his behaviour to sack Ben Britton has hit the mainstream. And Ben Britton is a very eloquent soldier. He was a star candidate for Clive Palmer and the UAP back in 22, and so much so that he went and joined the Liberal Party and jumped over a former sitting state member, if you will, in this Nathaniel Smith to get the nod to run for Whitlam. And he was, whilst he wasn't the favourite according to Sportsbet, he was certainly giving it a shake. And if the Liberals were going to win government, it was people like Ben Britton that were going to get elected for them in the south of Sydney seat of Whitlam. And since those been disendorsed and this other fellow's got in, and now Labor will put up their candidate and will likely retain the seat. No one wants the other guy, Nathaniel Smith. And so it is just interesting that Dutton just doesn't have the balls when it counts counts. And the same thing can be said with his very embarrassing back down with the public servants being told they have to come back to work. And of course, the public servants, who are the deep state, and we talked about this yesterday, are the ones that are saying, no, we want to be able to stay home. And it's almost as if now, if you're a public servant, you can tell me, but I've spoken to many of them who tell me what their day-to-day life is like. And there was one fellow I spoke to recently, and in a 40-hour week, he reckons he was probably doing about 10 hours of hard labor. And I thought it's so interesting that there's two sides to that story, in that people are being told that they're very productive, and yet they don't want to come back to the office. They want to be able to stay home and work from home in that regard.
Listen, the lefties are falling apart. The lefties are falling apart. Because of my new job, I've had to do something I swore I would never do, Jason. I went back on LinkedIn. Right. Yes. Because I'm trying to help the business I'm working for, and I'm trying to promote myself. I want to read something to you that floated past my LinkedIn yesterday and my jaw dropped. Are you ready for this? This is how lefties talk to each other. And let me tell you, if you want to do a scoop of where all the lefties are, they're on LinkedIn.
Oh,
right?
Yes, I know.
They love it in there. So this person, I won't name her, right? She's big in business, and in her photograph, she's sitting in like a Chanel suit at the Hyatt Hotel, right? They say they're left, but they certainly do live it up, these lefties, right? I stopped saying diversity and started getting heard. Something ridiculous happened in a meeting last week. Mid-sentence, I was about to say diversity, and I caught myself. I switched it to different perspectives on the fly, kept talking like nothing happened. Why? Because I watched an entire room of professionals do this weird verbal dance around words like diversity and inclusion. Nicola Charles said that's because everyone's absolutely over it. And then she goes on to say, the wildest part, these were the same people who moments earlier had passionately agreed we need to hire the best talent regardless of background, yet physically recoiled when someone dared to call it a diversity initiative. Same idea, same goal, different packaging, completely different reaction. When did perfectly normal words become conversation killers? And then I went down to the comments, Jason, and these are lefties, right? And this guy, I won't name him, he's a marketer, a web marketer, and he wrote DEI equals didn't earn it. Someone else wrote, another bloke who's a security analyst wrote, DEI is a scam. It creates a lower level of employee, not based on merit. The DEI that is being played out is worse than nepotism. Merit is the only tool for employers, not blackmail for every miscreant.
Beautiful.
So they're turning on themselves, right? Because they're only left on LinkedIn. You can guarantee that. They're Labour voters. They love Joe Biden and they hate Trump. That's just guaranteed. But you can see that their own narratives are falling down around their ears. And they're literally saying there, if they keep using them, they're getting funny looks.
Interesting, that whole position there, and you're right, because the privileged of the left, and that's the thing I can never understand, is a billionaire lefty. Do as I say, not as I do. And you've got people like this Governor Pritzker of Chicago coming out and saying how people are being mistreated by Trump's tariffs. I'm thinking, mate, you're a billionaire. Why don't you put your hand in your kick and go help out a few people?
What do you mean mistreated by the Trump tariffs? What about the Uyghurs in China? I think they've got more to worry about than a bloody tariff.
Well, the point of the tariffs is that what's it done? It's just dropped the price of oil. It's just by something like 20% overnight, which is everyone's screaming that we need to, handle inflation. And there you go. You got rid of inflation. Everyone said if you bring the price of oil down, you're going to stop inflation because the flow-on effects of transport affects everything. And to prove my point, what did Peter Dutton do rather than go for the $5 a week tax cut that Jim Chalmers said? He said, we won't do that. We're going to give you 25 cents off the fuel excise for the first 12 months of our next term in office. In other words,
it's like the pennies for the peasants. This is the Rothschild Rockefeller thing of, people hate you because you're too rich. Go out into the street. This is what they used to do, these guys. Go out into the street in your carriage like the big lord over everyone and throw pennies out the window. And people were like, oh, thank you, sir. We're so grateful. Thank you. Love you, sir. This is what they do. They're throwing you breadcrumbs because you're a peasant. It's bloody insulting.
But the point is that the drop in the oil price overnight equates to 25 cents a litre anyway, just on the reduced price of oil. So even though Dutton is saying that, yeah, we're going to cut it to kill inflation, it's already happened. So if could you imagine if
So
the
it's like a
price of
vanity credit for him.
well, the thing is, if the price of fuel at the moment is give or take $2 a litre, petrol, diesel, whatever, it's a little bit more, a little bit less, whatever. And I've seen it as low as, E10, not that I ever use E10 in any of my cars, but I saw it the other day for $1.59, which was pretty good. I saw diesel for about $1.65. If you average it and bring it up a little bit and then take off 25 cents and then you take off another 25 cents for the price of oil dropping, we might be paying $1.30 a litre for fuel in the second half of the year.
Well, they can't charge too much for diesel, Jason, because they're using it to charge up their EV chargers. So we've got to keep diesel down.
That's right. I have seen that. It's hilarious, isn't it? Yeah, that's the clean diesel, by the way, not the dirty diesel going
No,
into those.
it's a different one. It's a special diesel.
That's right. It's electric diesel. So it's fascinating. But there it is. So there are two sides to every story, and almost immediately you see this. But what do they focus on? The share prices of the retirees. So this is what the lefties are saying. The poor retirees, the share price. Hang on a second. You are the same lefties that are telling us that you want to put a death tax on the same retirees because they've made too much money off their houses and that we can't afford the house. So again, two sides to every story. Last week you didn't like them because they own the properties and they're too expensive. This week you like them because it suits you to like them because everyone's share price went down. And who are we learning owns the shares? 88% of all shares are owned by the top 12% of society and those people with enough money in their retirement funds.
Jason, they only like them this week because an election is coming. We're all popular this week. We're all popular. An election's coming.
Well, there it is again. So once again, for the individual trying to work out where they fit into the system, and I maintain that there will have to be a new way for people to be able to have institutional support, not necessarily the government, but other ways to find, like in other words, it would be great if there was a friendly banking system. It would be great if there was a friendly legal system. It would be great if there was a friendly medical system of all these things that we've experienced over the last few years. What it's taught, of course, is that pretty much effectively those people in society have one way or another gone into a kind of an underground type of lifestyle over the last 4 or 5 years and have become quite good at it. No one would have thought that an Australian in the 21st century would have to live like they were in World War II in France, for goodness sake, but that's kind of where we've come from. But of course, the darkest hour is always before the dawn, and this will lead to a new recovery after the fact. And one of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to tie it into my next thing I want to talk about with Dan Bongino's comments today in relation to Trump and the tariffs. He's saying that there will be a bounce back. There are people now, at least getting out on Fox News and saying that within 3-6 months there'll be a massive turnaround. Trump's saying already the money's coming through, etc. So there are good times. And of course, you've got those in Europe saying they want to do zero tariffs, 50 countries lining up to do it. So at the end of the day, as I said earlier, and I said in my report on Saturday, that the tariffs are designed to correct the balance of payments. In other words, America was set up through, various different relationships and free trade deals that it was the one that was going to pay for it. So you went to America because you didn't pay, there was no tariffs on anything. Everything was cheap when you went on a holiday to the United States, even if the exchange rate wasn't particularly good. But every other country is imposing tariffs on the US. So for the whole world to go into a meltdown and for the stock market to crash like it did, 10% in some places, stock markets halting, etc., is only because everyone has been a leech on the United States economy for the last 30 years, for goodness sake, longer. And only now Trump is the only person, Make America Great Again, that has the balls to stand up and actually do it. And he's done it. Now, where I was going with that was that I think that what's happening is that Trump is using the time for the justice system to get its act together to do what it needs to do. And that's why obviously the tariffs came up early and they're going to bounce back, and you always do your economic hard work up front in early on in a term. Now, therefore, that when push comes to shove, and the day that we all hope that we see someone of significance in handcuffs for the horrible crimes that they've perpetuated on us, if it came after the American economy had improved and everyone had got a lift, it will be a very different perspective. But if today you were to put one of these bad guys in handcuffs, it would only have another round of protests. People would actually protest if they saw Anthony Fauci in handcuffs today, if it came out that he did what he did, because they say, but Anthony Fauci's the good guy. So Dan Bongino has come out He's written this very interesting post on X, and he said, "I'm headed back to DC today after spending a day back home with my wife and daughter. As I dive back into work, I want to reassure you that nothing that is happening here is happening by accident. Because of the sensitivity of what the FBI deals with, both the director and I have to be circumspect in what we can make public. Bad guys read this stuff too. Neither one of us came here to play games. Measure us by results, you will see them, but just because you don't see something happening right this second doesn't mean it isn't happening." He said, "I'll conclude by stating that not every result is going to please everyone. That's just pandering, it's not leadership. Complex problems require diligence and a reform-oriented process to create lasting changes, or else you're simply putting a bandage on a gushing wound. Let's do it right." And then he said, "I'd like to add this. Your comments and criticisms are not only welcome, but they're helpful. We work for you, the American people. Your feedback is invaluable. All I ask is that you consider the following feedback to the feedback. When you see something happen and the entire story isn't public and the underlying facts aren't all public, it may appear counterintuitive to our reform agenda. I promise you it's not an accident. Ask yourself, why would I sign on to something like this otherwise? Is it a desire to be wealthy or famous or connected or to be a future lobbyist? If that sounds ridiculous, it's because it is. I realised when I signed up that I'd never be able to fully explain some decisions we make due to legal and ethical constraints, but that's a pill I agreed to swallow when I swore in. In conclusion, I realise asking you to trust me is a waste of time. Watch what happens, continue to demand results, be cautious of narrative traps, let time put the puzzle pieces together, and what we're doing will make sense. I see and hear you and your feedback. Thanks for your time. Dan Bongino." It's a big statement.
He sounds like a real person. We know he's a real person. He's gone through a lot. I think he battled throat cancer a few years ago. Loves his wife, fought like a wildcat. And I saw all of these pundits, which is what they were. It's amazing that he's the deputy director of the FBI now. Pete Hegseth, he was also a pundit that I watched on Fox News, and now he's, leading the military. I watched them all get demolished because they knew, like emotionally on air, because they knew when Biden got in that this new world order had at least temporary control, 4 years control of America. And I always said, I knew as soon as it happened, I said, Biden getting in the deep state was like this supermarket sweep. You've got 6 months to destroy a country, go. And he started on day one. I think he cancelled the Trans-Pacific pipeline, getting the oil down without damaging the environment from Canada or something on day one. But it's interesting that these people are now, they're not arrogant about it. They're not jumping around going, you were wrong, you screwed it all up, we're going to fix it. They're just quietly going about their business, and I really admire them for that. They're not grandstanding, I think that's the right word. Whereas, of course, when anyone in the left ever gets power, they grandstand. And what they also do is they ignore in the US the Constitution for the entirety of the administration. And then only when they leave, they cite the Constitution because it's going to protect them from all of the evils that they did when they were in the administration. So, yeah, very, very interesting what's happening. Do you know much about this book that was written in 1896 and released in 1900, Jason, by Ingersoll Lockwood, called The Last President? Because people are saying that this is about Trump.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because Ingersoll Lockwood wrote the book The Adventures of Baron Trump, which is also very interesting. And in that, the cartoon or the illustration of Baron Trump appears to look like a young Baron Trump.
Isn't it weird?
Yeah. It's an extraordinary story. Of course, the name is misspelt with an extra R, so there's a slight difference there. But the story of Ingersoll Lockwood and the story of John Trump and John Trump's connections to Nikola Tesla are extraordinary. Because when Nikola Tesla passed away, he died broke or bankrupt inside living in a hotel. And before the FBI arrived, apparently John Trump, the uncle of Donald Trump, managed to get into the hotel room and retrieve some form of papers or information or something. So there's some weird connections. So that's
because Trump's dealing with the guy who created the Tesla as well. Like, it's weird, isn't it? The way history is panning out. I mean, this is over, what's this now? 125 years ago.
this is the point, isn't it? So there are people that are arguing that that there's an argument that could Trump have some form of connection to something that's beyond the ordinary? Could he be a time traveler? Is things that people propose, because that whole story of Barron Trump is extraordinary. The last president, etc. Is it prophecy? Is it luck? And it's when when we were exploring the shooting of Donald Trump at that particular rally in Pennsylvania. I argued at the time that there are four plausible stories that, each of them are equally plausible. It was simply dumb luck that he turned his head at that exact right moment. You could argue that it was a false flag, that it was set up. There are people that will argue that. You could argue that it was time travel, that they knew what was going on.
Well, someone told me, a very intelligent friend of mine, and you know who you are, tells me that Donald Trump is a time traveler. I know this is going to sound crazy to the listeners, because he said there's a couple of different versions of Trump. And in basic terms, sometimes he's fat and sometimes he's not. Right. And that he sent me pictures, and it's like, these are both Trump, but they are different men from a different time. And I'm like, look, I'm working 6 days a week. This is hard for me to get my head around. I try and live in as much logic as I can. I've always been like that. But there are a lot of pointers there, and I know you're into this stuff, Jason. And I do interviews, with people who definitely believe that there are other things going on. But it's just, I want to know. Before I die, I want to feel like I've, crossed that Rubicon, that hump in the road, that we're approaching a hump in the road, right? And we can't see over it, but we know for sure that all the interesting stuff we need to know is just across the brow of that hill. And it's like one of those nightmares you have where the faster you run, the slower you go, right? You can't get to this hump in the road. But I just want to know. And no matter how scary it is or how daunting, I would rather know before I go, Jason, would you?
Oh, look, I don't want to know before I go. I want to know tomorrow. So I'm a little bit more impatient. But the comments from Bongino are very important. They certainly steady the ship. There's enough blackpilling going on, and there's enough people, influential people in the independent, citizen journalist media space that just keep looking for any negative point to say, see, I told you they're controlled opposition. I want to make this point. If at this point you're still calling Trump controlled opposition, I hate to say it, but you're the controlled opposition, because you can't possibly do what he did with the tariffs and that be something that they put in place to get their way. Like, it is implausible at this point to think what is going on. And then people will then jump ahead and they'll say, a lot of people are, of course, talking about Trump and Israel, etc. And then they want to talk about Howard Lutnick. Now, I don't know if everyone knows this, but Howard Lutnick, who is the Secretary of Commerce there for Trump, Howard Lutnick was the chairman of Cantor Fitzgerald. That was the firm that existed in the World Trade Center that on September 11 lost 658 employees out of the almost, 2,400 that perished on that day. So Cantor Fitzgerald alone lost more than 25% of the entire people who died on that day. Howard Lutnick was the chairman of the firm. His own brother died in the attack. Now, someone said, well, that's because Howard Lutnick didn't die in that because he was given that warning that day, that we know that there were warnings. However, Howard Lutnick was taking his child to kindergarten that morning for his first day of kindergarten. So that's a perfectly plausible explanation. So there are people that are saying, oh no, Howard Lutnick's a bad guy. So let's explore that for a moment. If Howard Lutnick was a bad guy and found an excuse not to be there, but let his brother die and 657 other employees in the World Trade Center, then Howard Lutnick is worse than Satan and deserves the worst. But your argument says that he did that in order to get a job with Trump in the presidency 25 years later. It's a ludicrous argument. However, if you then look at it the other way, that those of us that have been following along can see Mossad's fingerprints on 9/11. And of course, there's a lot that we can discuss there about that.
Yeah, but you've got to separate Mossad from Jewish people and Zionists
Correct.
and stuff. And
Correct.
people struggle with that.
Now there is a difference. Now, if you then look at that, if Howard Lutnick 24 years later becomes a higher up in the Trump administration. And we know Donald Trump's position on 9/11. He was the most outspoken on it. He said those buildings couldn't have fallen the way that they did. He's put the 9/11 inside the JFK files, the RFKs, the ET, and that super group that was headed by Anna Paulina Luna. The 9/11 truth is buried in that as well. And you'll notice that this is not talked about a lot because it's all about timing. So then you add Bobby Kennedy into the administration, whose uncle was murdered as the Attorney General running for president. He was the former Attorney General running for president. And of course, his uncle was murdered as well. And we don't know what happened to JFK Jr. officially, although we're told the story about the aeroplane, and that kind of doesn't all add up. And that's a story for another day. So if you've got two people with a vested interest to find out who killed their families. So Howard Lutnick's brother is taken out in 9/11. Bobby Kennedy's taken out, and JFK, which we now know is a certainty, it's the CIA, and they're in the administration. You can't possibly say and have a plausible argument that Kennedy, despite what he just said about MMR, and we can talk about that another time as well, is controlled opposition. These people are playing down the line, and something is coming. And so you have to get to a point where you go, could you imagine if we wanted to achieve justice in Australia, but what we had to do is to become the Prime Minister, the Minister for Health and the Minister for Finance, and that's where we got to, and then they're going to, no, you're controlled opposition. No way in the world. We can't even get Ben Britton to run for Whitlam. He falls over because Dutton cuts him off at the knees over comments he said that were perfectly reasonable comments about women in combat being forced into the roles. 80% of them are pulling out due to medical discharges because they can't cope and don't want to be there in the first place. To say that you got the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, who has just annihilated the globalists with the strike of a pen on tariffs, who's going to recorrect the market, who's got rid of inflation overnight, instantly gone, but your retirement funds is what people are worried about. No one in America's got any retirement funds in the bottom 50%, as we learned today. They can't even pay their rent, these poor people. But what they will need is for fuel prices to go down, grocery prices to go down, jobs to return to the United States that are good paying jobs. Are you kidding me? This is the golden age of America happening right now. This is the greatest moment in the history of our lifetimes. What we're seeing is a complete recalibrating of the system, that everyone who's been leeching off the US is now going to pay their fair share. The US will become the richest state in the world. And what a great time to want to become the 51st state, for goodness sake, where you'd have all of these wonderful relationships, the strength of the United States and the military. Nicola, that is my my comments and rants as we get to the end of the show. I'm going to throw back to you as we need to sign off.
I think these crooks like us, they talk about identify as this and identify as that. And I had to identify as a fluffy white bunny to get back on X, which turned out to be quite successful as a white rabbit. That's all good. But, and they like to divide us up by ethnic groups, and it's this group and it's that group, and all of that stuff, all of that discussion online, that's never censored, right? They want us arguing amongst ourselves. But my dream is it's a bit arrogant, I suppose. My dream is for people to be like me. I was born in the UK, but I identify as an Australian, right? I live here. I'm married to an Australian. I love Australia. I always have. I always will. And I feel Australian. And I think those people you're referencing who are working with Trump in America, they feel American. They don't want to be divided up by whose uncle, father got assassinated, who's Jewish or anything else. And because I'm a migrant into this country as well, it's an interesting position. I've got friends from all these different ethnic groups. I've got Lebanese friends, I've got Jewish friends, I've got Muslim friends, Chinese friends, all these different groups, and everyone's got an axe to grind. As I said earlier, we're told not to be racist to people who are very racist because their racism is open when you talk to them. There's groups of people they don't like. And my dream is that people identify with the country they're living in. And I don't understand why you would invite migrants into a country to then want to identify as the nationality they came from within a closed off community within Australia or within America, right? It just seems really odd to me. You're either an Australian or you're an American or you're British or you're Canadian. Stop letting these crooks divide you up by categories they know would help us keep fighting with each other. Because if we're fighting with each other, we're not turning and looking up at the real enemy, the real T-Rex above us, fighting for what? Same old thing they always fight for: money and control and power. And if we stop fighting with each other, we become a dangerous animal, because we might be the little people on the ground, but by God, there's billions of us if they're to be believed. And, you know, what happens to us if billions of bees or tiny ants come on us? We're in real trouble, no matter how big we are. And that's the kind of power we've truly got. Thank you for listening again to the Daily Australian. To myself, running out of breath, Nicola Charles, and my co-host and co-producer, Jason Olborn. Have a fantastic Tuesday. Love each other, care about each other. We will do this all over again tomorrow.